going to our next talk. So what you heard in these first two talks were basically voices of the community or voices from the ground. So now what we're going to do is do a polar opposite view of the informal economy. We have Professor Amitabh Kundu, who was the professor and dean of School of Social Sciences at JNU. He was a member of the National Statistical Commission during 2006 and 2008, and what is now famously known as the Kundu Committee report, which established basically did an evaluation for the urban housing shortage in India, and that work is now called the Kundu Committee report. For several of us who are in this profession, currently is chairing a committee to monitor the national survey for Swachh Bharat mission for the Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation. He's been a visiting professor in many places, has published many books, many research articles. So I'm going to hand it over to Professor Kundu, who will talk about sort of the scale of the problem of, the scale of the challenge of the informal economy in India. How many migrants, how many workers, what kind of access, the kind of numbers he was referring to. So over to you, Professor Kundu. Again, we'll try to make this session interactive, so keep the questions coming in, and at the appropriate moments, I might intervene and try to pose your question to Professor. So over to you, Professor Kundu.
I enjoyed the two preceding sessions. One, the experience from the ground level, covering the auto rickshaw driver situation and the street vendors. Mr. Rao was very, very informative. And then the political economy of water supply for Greater Mumbai. I thought, Madhav, if you allow me, I will change the structure of my presentation. I'll pick up the issues from the discussions that have taken place and the important parameters which have been identified, particularly by Mr. Shashank Rao. You see, first thing that he mentioned, which impressed me.
Professor Kundu, I think your video is turned off, so maybe if you can turn on your video so the people can see.
Just one second. My video is not coming up. Kapil, video क्यों नहीं आ रहा है? Just give me a second. I have an expert sitting next to me.
Okay, excellent. Now we can see you.
Okay.
Yes, we can see you. So,
thank you. The first thing that I gather from what Shashank Rao talked about in the context of the two very important components of the informal sector, my face is seen.
Yes, we can hear you. No, we can see you. Fantastic. Carry on. Yeah.
Now, you see, the first point is that there is not much of an information. When the government announces certain benefits to be reaching the households of the auto rickshaw wallahs or the street vendors or even the elderly people, pensioners or the widows or physically challenged person, the statistics does not exist. And that is the reason why when different surveys have been conducted, I must tell you the civil society has been very active. They have gathered information that who are eligible under this Prime Minister's, Garibi targeted program, who are being affected by COVID-19. You find the studies which have been done. I know one by Dalberg, other by an NGO in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, and World Vision is also doing a study along with National Institute of Urban Affairs. They show that eligibility under different programs is not more than 50 to 60%. In some cases, even it is less than 40%. Eligibility. So it means there is a problem in. Am I Madhav? Kapil, I think I got.
No problem. Please carry on. I just turned off my video because of internet issues.
Is that all right?
Yes. Please carry on.
Are you?
We can hear you, Professor Kundu. You can carry on.
Okay, fine. Okay, and then I can't see anything, nor I can hear anything. But nonetheless, let me carry on. So the first thing that strikes me is that the lack of information, and that is the reason why the ground level feedback that we are getting is not more than 50 to 60% are getting covered under different programs. Although I think the central government and the state government in many of the states are trying desperately to reach out to the poorer section, because we don't have the information, that is creating a problem. Second issue that again came up is that welfare boards and other registration system is not inclusive. And you do find in case of Mumbai, in case of whole of Maharashtra, while registration for auto rickshaw wallahs were there, but not for the street vendors. And that creates problem because the unions do not exist there in the same manner. You find that the coverage is very, very low under these programs. The third thing that strikes me is that when you are doing the registration, and now there's a big demand for the first time, I think the crisis has brought to the fore the problems of the migrant workers. The numbers are not there, and there are talks about migrants being registered properly, different vulnerable sections of the workforce to be registered properly. You do find that the registration system often becomes exclusionary. The kind of documents which are required really pushes out many people. And that's the reason why Shashank was mentioning that people would perhaps pay 1,500 rupees bribes and not perhaps get registered because it becomes cheaper, because getting the required document for registration sometimes works out to very, very difficult to get. And I know in case of the domestic help, the police verification and the kind of documents that are required for coming through a formal channel is so prohibitively expensive that you find that instead of increasing the flow of the domestic help into the big cities, it really constrains that. And final point that I would like to mention before I go to the macro scenario is that the government provisions in times of crisis comes up is really, for example, social distancing. This came up not for saving the domestic help and the unorganized sector from getting infected by COVID-19, the virus, because it actually came from outside the country. It affected the upper sector, the organized sector, and also the businessmen who had global linkages. So social distancing worked very well for the middle class, for the upper class, because within the upper class and the middle class, interactions became much less. It also reduced the interaction between the organized sector and unorganized sector. It was really not to protect the domestic help from getting infected or the unorganized sector to get infected, but to protect the organized sector. Now, what has happened? You cannot have the organized sector function independent of the unorganized sector workers, informal sectors workers, without the supply chain. And because of the supply chain, now the infections have come down, and it is now alarming in major cities. I just wanted to mention about the informal sector. We do find that there is a lack of data for informal sector. Look at economic survey. It mentions 93% of the Indian workforce are informal. Look at Niti Aayog's document, which came just 6 months ago. It mentioned 85% of the workers are in informal sector. Periodic labor force survey of National Sample Survey says in the outside agriculture, 65% are in informal sector. Really, you do not have the proper data. You can, informal sector is not one category. There are different kinds of social security provisions. Only 7 to 8% have proper social security provision with, pension funds and access to health and educational facilities. Rest of them have 1 or 2 schemes. So it depends on where you draw the line. If you want to show informal sector to be 60%, you can always say small little programs of the state government, crop insurance program under ESIC, employees state insurance scheme, some marginal benefits of health are being given. If you want to include that, you can say, okay, informal sector is 40%. But I personally believe that Niti Aayog estimate that 85% of the people are really not being covered in any proper sense. There is small little insurance benefits might be there. Some programs may be reaching them, but certainly that is an area. But let me question one major proposition which is being talked about in the policy domain and also in the research, that there is significant informalization of the urban economy. Also, there is a proposition that cities in India are going exponentially, and ADB talks about, Asian Development Bank talks about urban avalanche hitting India. The World Bank talks about epicenter of urbanization shifting to India. If you look at the rate of growth of urban population in India, you do find that it has decelerated significantly. During 70s, the rate of growth of urban population was nearly 4% per annum in the 70s. In the 80s, it came down to 3.1%. In the 90s, it came down further to 2.7%. And in 2001 and 2011, it remained at 2.7%. It did not go up. And actually, it would have gone down to 2.5%, not 2.7, but 2.5%, just because 3,000 new urban centers were identified. Otherwise, if you take the large cities, 25 large cities, excepting Bengaluru and Puducherry, you find that all these cities have decelerated, their growth rate have gone down. There has been exclusionary urbanization. And I do believe that there has been some amount of formalization of the informal sector in the urban areas. And that is what has excluded many of the poor, dispossessed migrants to come into the large cities. I would like to clarify this point. You see, I did talk about, informal formalization. Earlier in the 60s and the 70s, it is possible for someone to come from the rural areas, put up a shanty, bribe a local policeman, and stay and continue to do business, doesn't get registered with the electricity department, doesn't talk about the industry department, it starts a small little business. But now it is not possible. There are certain requirements which have to be fulfilled. So to that extent, I would say there is informal formalization. The tragedy of informal formalization is that while workers get bound, tied down, required to fulfill certain responsibilities, the benefits do not reach them. The workers become much more vulnerable. In fact, the people who are employing them take the benefit of informal formalization. And as a result of that, as I mentioned, domestic help, if you come to the formal channel, they get much more exploited because the companies which bring them take 1 month's salary. There are various kinds of requirements. So I have a feeling that when you're talking about registration, bringing the rickshawalas and the street vendors under welfare boards, your requirements of documents for inclusion, for making them members, registering them, should not be exclusionary. It should not really be so much expensive that it becomes cheaper to go out of in the street and bribe the policeman. So I would certainly feel that informal sector's requirement has now sharply come into the policy domain because of the crisis, and there is a political need for registering them. But my submission certainly is that we should have the registration and bringing them under welfare board in such a manner that it is inclusive. Madhav, if I can have another 5 minutes.
Just one, if you can talk a little bit about the migration, right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
If you have any numbers
Madhav,
on the
I just
migration,
wanted to come to that point. As far as migration is concerned, the rate of migration was more or less stable and it was not very high. Only 30% of the people in this country were migrants. Now, in 2011 census, for the first time, the migration rate picked up. From 30%, it became 37%. It was Arvind Subramaniam who first used the railway traffic data and said that interstate migration is very high, India on the move and surging ahead. But if you look at the railway data has serious problems. And I don't think the figure that he said 9 million people are crossing state borders every year, if that was correct, the demography of the country would have been different. But nonetheless, he did flag the issue that migration has picked up during 2001 and 2011, and it's likely to go up in 2021 also. I'll give you some macro statistics about the interstate migrants. The interstate migrants, according to my estimate, based on 2011, 12, and the data from census and NSS, is that there are 70 million interstate migrants in the country. 72 million in the interstate migrants. Out of them, the work participation rate, generally for the people, it is 40% of the total population who are in the workforce. But in case of migrants, since there's a younger age group, about 45% would be in the working group. So 32 million of these interstate migrants are workers. Now, I wanted to know, out of these interstate migrants, how many of them are in self-employment? How many of them are in casual employment? And how many of them are in regular employment? You find 50% of the urban migrants are in self-employment, 15% are in casual employment, and 35% are in regular employment. Now, if 50% of the migrants are in self-employment, as I mentioned, total number of workers among the interstate migrants is 32 million. The figure would come to about 11 million if you take only 70%, 70% of the self-employed people do not have any social security. So out of the 50% self-employment, we find 70% do not have any social security. So about 11 million of the migrants who are in self-employment do not have any social security. Madhav, is that point clear? Second,
yes.
Second, as far as the casual employment is concerned, it's only 15%, but 95% of the casual workers are not having any social security, which gives another 5 million. So 11 million self-employed who do not have social security, 5 million casual employment who do not have any social security, and 35% of the migrants are in regular employment. But 50% of them do not have social security, which gives another 5 million. So total number of people who have become vulnerable as a result of this COVID-19 is 21 million of the interstate migrants are vulnerable. They have either lost jobs, are going to, or will be losing jobs in this month or next month. Now, this is the major issue. What this 21 million migrants, what do we do with them? We have not got them registered. We have not taken care of the social security issues, health issues, education or shelter issues. Now, my submission was that out of this, the state government should have tried to give them incentives, keep them for 3-4 months of lockdown, give them some kind of a minimum support, and then say that please do not go back. And I'm sure in some of the states they have done it, and some of the employers have been able to give them some kind of an incentive so that they're staying back. But a large number of them want to go back. They want to go back firstly because of, the Rabi harvesting was due. So they wanted to go back. Every year they go back for this purpose. And Kharif, sowing is also there. So, or more importantly, this is a social psychological trauma of COVID-19. They just want to go back. And I have a feeling the central government announcing a ban on interstate movement of the workers, some of the state governments announcing that no, we don't need trains for that, certainly added to their trauma. The informal workers, large number of them being migrant population, were really traumatized. And I thought many of the leaders of civil society, we tried to talk to the people in the Niti Aayog, and we tried to impress through the media also that immediate provision should be made to take those people who are desperate to go back to their states, to provide them safe transport. The way they are moving out, in the truck loads, in the buses, congested buses. Now, of course, things are perhaps becoming somewhat better. That is certainly very, very risky. Now, one question that has been asked in this context, that suppose you take these informal workers back to their districts, these interstate migrants back to the areas from where they come from, is there a risk of spreading the virus, coronavirus, to the rural areas, to the small and medium towns? I would not rule that out, because there is this possibility that the virus will travel with them. But nonetheless, we know that there can be testing facilities at the district level. Yes.
We have actually a little more time now. Okay, your session, your talk was very good. I think more people have signed up, and now we have a little more time. So I thought, why don't we respond to some of the questions, and you can sort of continue your talk in that form, so that we also respond to
Excellent.
some. So,
Excellent. Madhav, just give me 2 minutes. I'll finish this. Can I
Sure.
have 2 minutes?
sounds, yes, please.
So as I was saying, that there is some amount of risk, and I think I know many of the districts. I come from Madhya Pradesh. My district, the collector, I talked to him. He has taken enough precaution. Whosoever is coming, he will get the person tested, give them some kind of a e-permit to go back to the village, and the person has to interact and report the health status. And I think that is extremely important. There has to be increased unlocking of mobility within the district. The state government should receive the migrants after the checkup which is being done at the place of origin, but they should check them at the place of destination, at the 4 or 5 centers where the trains will drop them, and from there the state government can take them to the district headquarters. The major treatment for corona is not like as complicated as a heart bypass surgery. There will be critical cases. They have to be referred back to the main centers of the state, within the state, and rest of them can be treated locally. And I think it is very much possible, but nonetheless, I believe that the risk of keeping these interstate migrants in the ghettoized condition is even much more riskier. I would like to tell you this final statistics. About 35% of the households in the urban areas are living in one room unit. About 40% in the large cities are going out for toilet and drinking water facilities. What does social distancing mean for them? In fact, the moment you say you don't come out of the slums, there is more congestion. They are within the slums, sitting, in a group, chatting, or sitting under a tree playing cards. So I think that the social distancing was really meant for the upper and the middle class, and it has been successful. It has stopped the spreading of the virus in the upper and the middle class. But unfortunately, the same factor of social distancing, you cannot apply it to the slum areas. And that's why you do find that the slum areas have become hotspots in most of the major cities. Madhav, I will stop here for your questions.
I mean, these are questions from the audience. Yeah. So I will go down the list and maybe I'll read out 3 or 4 questions maybe at once. So yeah. So why? I mean, I think one general question. I think has been that this. Do you think our state governments trying to hold back migrants? Is there a politics being played out in this context? So this is one question. Do you think state governments are trying to hold back migrants? And who will do the work in the cities, etc.? And how do you see politics play out in this situation? That's one question. Then there is there's a couple of questions of this sort. There is a general question on, what is, one is the question of informal, and then the other question is what is poor, right? They are saying that auto rickshaw drivers, etc., may not be poor. So, some comment on, what is, informal is one, but what is, in your case, what is poverty or income, kind of any response to that. So maybe you answer these 2 questions and then we can go to.
Thank you, Madhav. Madhav, I must say that I'm not very competent to answer this question, that how the state government politics is there to stop the migrant, because I don't work at that level. But I can clearly tell you from the statement that have made, I don't have any independent access to the corridors of power, but the statement that the ministers have don't do the actual manual work. They depend on the migrants from Orissa, from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. That is what.
Unclear.
Sorry?
Your voice is a little unclear. Can you just pause for a second and then resume in just 15 seconds?
Kapil?
Maybe you can actually switch off your video.
Should I switch off my video?
I think that would be better for the conversation.
Okay, I switch off my video. Okay, is it now better?
Better, yes.
Okay, so as I was saying, that Punjab certainly at this moment needs large number of migrant workers from Bihar, from Uttar Pradesh, from Madhya Pradesh, and Without them, they have to use harvester combine in a big way, which is turning out to be expensive. If they had the access to the migrant workers, it would have been cheaper and more profitable for the middle and large farmers. This is one thing. Secondly, the construction industry. Many of the other industries in Karnataka certainly is going to miss these migrant laborers. They did not realize the importance of the migrant laborers when there was no crisis, when they were there. They employed the migrants at their own terms, and suddenly when they realize they may go and may not come back in 2-3 months time, they're worried about it. And that's why I think there were some influence in many of the states, I would say in Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka, and also in Kerala. There is a strong lobby that the laborers should not go back and they should stay back. And I know some industrialists whom I talk to in Kerala, the Kerala's policies have been, I think, much more favorable to the interstate migrants. They try to take care of them, but certainly they want them to come back. Otherwise, Kerala's economy is going to really take time to pick up. But nonetheless, having said that, my submission is that nobody should be detained against their wishes. If the people are desperate to go back for social, emotional, psychological reasons, they should be allowed to go. But my analysis of regional development shows that Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, no matter how they try to absorb these migrant laborers who have come back, they would not be in a position to provide adequate employment. Within 2-3 months, these people will realize that the rural economy and the regional economy would not provide the same kind of an income. And I don't think we should be unnecessarily worried about the reverse migration which has taken place. It will not destroy the overall development process, but at least 3-4 months of time should be given. I wish that the employers in the developed states like Maharashtra, like Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala also is one of them, Delhi, they realize the importance of the migrant workers. They should develop much more, humane relationship in the period of crisis. If these migrant workers were told that you do not worry about your salary for next 3 months, we will take care of your food and your accommodation. Don't worry about that. They wouldn't have been walking and cycling back to their places of origin. So I personally believe that this reverse migration is a short-term phenomena. It is possible for the state governments to take care of the health issues, but if they are forced to stay back in the ghettoized conditions in Bengaluru, in Chennai, in Mumbai, in Delhi, and I know Nagpur also, in the slum areas, COVID-19 is spreading like anything. This is far more dangerous than taking them in a dispersed manner to district headquarters and take care of them, because this problem that we have created, the spreading of virus which has taken place at an alarming rate just because of the social distancing. You cannot have a same social distancing formula applied across the categories for the rich, for the middle class and the poor. The moment you talk about social distancing being imposed in the slum areas, actually you are increasing congestion, degree of interaction. I told you 35% of the households in urban areas live in one-room unit. How do you expect them to observe social distancing? They will come out of their rooms and interact with the slum people because they can't get out of the slums, and they will spread the virus. So I am happy that the government has realized. I did try to raise this issue along with many of my other colleagues who are working at the field level, and I think the state governments have realized that there is an urgent need of sending them back, and certainly given the employment possibilities which will come up with the governmental programs, release of 20 lakh crore, I hope they really go to promote the small and medium scale sectors, which is labor intensive. There will be demand created and people would certainly come back. Coming to this issue of informal and poor, you see, informal sector means you are not part of any formal registration process. You are not covered under certain welfare boards. You are, your income is in a way free. You have to pay the income tax, but other restrictions do not apply. In that, even the doctors who their private practice, they would be included. Lawyers would be included. A large number of non-poor would be part of the informal sector because they are not going for the registration system. They are not going to the organized sector. So poor, there can be, largely it is the informal sector, but even those who are in the formal sector, those who are in the organized sector, they can be poor because many of the organized industries are employing the informal workers on a casual basis, on contract basis. And the PLFS survey, Periodic Labor Force Survey, which was conducted in 2017-18, the results of which were not allowed to be published for some political reason for some time, that shows that 50% of the people who are in the organized sector are not having any social security. So to say that formal sector cannot be poor is not correct. As I said, 50% of the people who are in the organized sector do not have social security. Although there is a strong overlap, a large percentage among the informal workers could be poor. But to say that all informal workers are poor or all formal workers are non-poor would be an error. I will stop here for the next question.
Yeah. So two more questions. One is around that there are more questions, but let's go with the next two questions. One is around, you talked a little bit about reverse migration, but
Right.
they were talking about the impact of reverse migration on women employment in the villages. What will that be, and any thoughts on that? And then there is a second question that is essentially, to language. One of the things is, what do you think is the size of the language barrier? There's a specific comment about people from the Northeast, where self-employed workers are not covered under the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act, etc. Because of language provision issues. So these two questions, if you can respond, and then maybe one or two more, and then we can wrap up. So I'm also trying to club the questions. So yeah.
Right. Thank you. In fact, the reverse migration, how the return of the interstate migrants and also within the state migrants from the big cities to the rural areas and small towns, how would that affect the women employment? And that's an important question because in the reverse migration, interstate migrants have a high male-female ratio. So the return migrants are, large percentage of them are men, and they will create demand for jobs. But in Manrega, there is already a preference being given for women employment. Manrega needs to be strengthened. This 10% of the GDP, which is being put for dealing with the present crisis, they should strengthen Manrega. And also in many of the employment generation schemes of the state government and also central government, there should be provision of having certain reservation for the women. We know that for the last decade and a half, women employment rate has been declining. This is a major matter of concern. And if India has to reach anywhere near the 5 trillion economy, the work participation rate among women, skill development for women has to go up. But at the present time of crisis, I would think that Manrega having stricter observance of the female employment and also in the construction activities of the state and central government, greater emphasis being given to women employment would be very, very important. As far as language is concerned, I did a field-based survey in Kerala and Madhya Pradesh. In Kerala, particularly, I found a large number of migrants from Northeast. I was surprised to find that large number of Bengalis, and some of them may be from Bangladesh, but they had absolutely no problem with the language. In fact, once they are working in a setup, many of them are in the small hotel, restaurant business, their language is not an issue. In the construction sector also, language is not an issue. What was an issue, I must tell you, was the moment there will be a problem of law and order, there will be one incident of violence, one murder taking place, immediately there is a lobby which comes up in the newspaper article, these migrants are responsible for this. That tension is coming up, and you really can't help it, because what has happened over time that the southern states have reached the population stabilization. Within the next 5 to 10 years, you will find the states like Kerala, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, their population growth rate will be zero, their population will get stabilized. Whereas the total fertility rate, that number of women born to number of children born to a woman, is about 3.1, around 3 in Bihar, in Uttar Pradesh, in Rajasthan. So that is a major matter of anxiety and worry, because population growth is very high in the northern states. So there has to be north-south mobility, and there is a demand for it. The private sector wants the laborers to come in because they are much cheaper than the local laborers. So there has to be the social tension. Maharashtra, for example, has lost out in these migrants because of the, local Amcha Manus thesis coming up, and that has affected the migration. And I think the migrants had built up Maharashtrian economy to a significant extent. Their contribution has not been adequately recognized. But now I have a feeling that many of the southern states are very much depending on these migrants to come back, and they would come back after 3-4 months of stay. But certainly their socio-economic conditions, the terms of employment, the terms of living and access to basic amenities has to go up. Particularly, I think social security provisions have to be made. And if one good thing happens as a result of this crisis, the migrant laborers are treated much more humanely and with a lot of sensitivity, taking care of the emotional requirements. That would be certainly one good learning for us.
So 2 more questions, Professor.
Please.
Yeah. One on
Yeah.
sort of, just a broad question. So broad question on, how can we better create this data, given this situation and the lack of information. And there is a lot of big data today available through mobile phones and other things. Do you think, there could be, if there was a big effort with participation from philanthropy and others and government joint effort, do you think we could very quickly generate this kind of information maybe in the next 3 to 6 months? Is that possible even?
Madhav, you are asking a very, very fundamental issue. Since I've worked in the National Statistical Commission, I've often argued that the state of our data on urban employment, urban housing, access to drinking water and sanitation by different social groups, migrant, non-migrant groups, instead of improving the quality of data, has gone down. And that's not because we don't have technology. You're right, the big data is available. But I think there is, I just can't clearly state it how exactly it works. There is a vested interest in getting the information in a very neat manner. If you know that the subsidy which is being given under Prime Minister's Awas Yojana is not reaching the poorer sections, although in the program document, you say this is meant only for the poor. And you can clearly show with the data that things are not happening in the way we have talked about. Similarly, access to sanitation facilities, migrant workers' condition. I think if there is a political economy which says, yes, this demand has to be met, and I hope that the concern that politicians are showing now, as I see on the television programs, as I see in various public documents, and also the civil society media have become concerned about the conditions of the migrant workers. If that remains, it should be possible to build up the information. India, as far as our statistical system is concerned, is one of the best in the whole world, not only compared to the developing countries. It compares well with the developed countries. I do not understand why our data system on migrant workers, where they are working, where they are living, what is their access to sanitation, drinking water. I've been trying to build up the data along with my friend, Mr. Mohanan. We just can't do that given this kind of barriers. But I personally would like to suggest that this should be possible. This is the necessity of the hour, and we should not let this demand die down. We should be able to build up the information system for the migrant workers. Thank you.
A couple of other small questions. One you sort of responded to, but I think is very relevant is, is this, especially the impact on girl education, and, the girls will get dropped out, forced into early marriage. So, can there be some targeted effort, and again, any numbers on that if you have, and then thinking about how that could be done. The other thing is, there are some, there's some broad questions on reverse migration. I think you've answered a lot of them. But and then one big question is, do you see any role for like micro donations, e-commerce portals in creating some welfare or combating some of these social inequalities? Do you think that is even possible? What kind of contribution numbers can help? So if you can, since you're able to very quickly generate these national level numbers, do you have some math that can help some micro donation e-commerce portals in creation of these sort of welfare and sort of programs or some kind of sort of parallel programs. So,
Madhav, I must warn you. I mean, I look much more confident than my database should allow me to do that. I have been trying to, use some of the coefficients for the non-migrant population and making some adjustment and generating the figures. Because when I talk to the senior officials in Niti Aayog, they said, Dr. Kundu, we need the data. Now, this is not the time that you need precise information. We have to act. Whether it is 5 million people who want to go back to their states or it is 8 million people, doesn't matter. We have to improve their mobility. As far as the question about the girls' dropout rate is concerned, we have national sample survey data. This very clear information. We can have income-wise, income category-wise, we can have age-wise, and we know that the dropout rate from the schooling system for the girls begins at 11 years, whereas for the boys, it starts at 12 and a half and 13 years. In the rural areas, dropout rate for the girls begin even earlier than that. So basically, we have to, and we, in fact, for Sachar Commission, post-Sachar Commission, we found out the dropout rate for the girls and boys for scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, Muslims, non-Muslims. So that data is available. But somehow, not much of what data is available is used in policy making. It should be possible to show as the ADB model, which projected. Do you believe ADB projected Indian economic growth for the next 3 decades, just before 5 years, to be 7% against the global growth rate, which will be less than 3%. But they assume that in order India has 7% growth rate, female workforce participation rate must go up. Female skill development must go up. Without that, you cannot have that projected rate of growth. So I think that women employment and women's education and skill development is extremely important. As far as the welfare programs and contribution of civil society and the community, I think that is very important. I somehow feel that the government didn't realize that just a lockdown will only help the middle and upper class. But if you really want to reach the lower levels, slum population and unorganized sector, those who are constituting the backbone of the supply system, you just cannot have, social distancing. You have to, the state has got no power to distribute, even provide carrier provisions to your doorstep. You need them. So I thought the state should have engaged the community level and civil society activists in a much bigger way. At the moment, I know there are many localities where an elderly couple lives there and do not know how to go to the hospital. You have not created a network of the communities. And when I talk to the local resident welfare association, they say, yes, we are very much willing. We should be told what is the safety protocol, how can we move out. You can't say the biggest patriotism is to stay at home. The biggest patriotism is to find out what is the safety standards, how can I move out, what kind of kits I need if I want to take my neighbor to the hospital, or if I need to bring the basic amenities to his doorstep. I have a feeling the government should have engaged the civil society and community in a much bigger way in the urban areas. In the rural areas, thankfully, it is happening already. The rural activists and the community organization are very much helping the vulnerable sections to get the access to the minimum level of facilities. I personally thought that the social distancing should have been imposed in consultation of the civil society and getting them into consideration. On the one hand, you say you do not move out of your house. On the other hand, you say take care of the poor. I personally wanted to know how can I go out and identify the poor in the slum areas. But I did not know what would be the safety protocol, and I did not know whether police will allow me to do that. There's no clarity at the ground level that what is permitted and what is not permitted. That clarification should have certainly helped in building much better system of delivery and the informal sector economy not crashing as it has happened. Madhav.
No, Professor, I think we're at 6:20. I think broadly, I think you've answered most of the questions. I mean, of course, on reverse migration, on, women participation, ability of, states to handle all of the reverse migration, which you say in 3-4 months, people should come back, should be back. So I think, and I think the whole questions around data, and I think clearly, I think the themes that are emerging is of course, I think learning from this to this whole crisis to actually have better protocols. I think, we have good protocols on flooding and other things, disasters. I think similarly, I think pandemics and these kind of things, I think a set of protocols will have to be developed, and in which, a lot of these sort of the whole informal economy and the migrant labor, etc., get treated humanely and in the best possible way. So that's one sort of clear message from the talk, and good clear protocols on who does what, and how do we engage more people to help solve the problem as well, both individuals and then sort of community groups which have some amount of organization. And we heard from Lisa's talk also about the role that the valve operators or the chaviwalas play, and how these people who actually have a lot of information can be used to create more. And then the third point, and I think this is a broader question, I think for what government does, but also for what us as third sector can do to actually generate more reliable, robust information about and whether there are now techniques with geospatial information, big data from mobile phones, etc., and also the localized knowledge from the chaviwalas and the chaviwala equivalents. Is there a way for us to construct kind of information that can really help not only sort of us overcome this crisis, but actually, deal with this real problem that slowly the entire country is discovering that we have about sort of closing our eyes to the informal economy. So, so thank you very much, I think, for your very sort of informative and educational talk. Thank you also to the previous speakers, Shashank Rao and Lisa Blockman, for their contributions. And we will now, our particular session will sort of meet tomorrow morning, where we'll actually talk about service delivery, affordable housing, better correlation between, better alignment between community and community groups and states, state capacity, government capacity. So I think this was much to sort of highlight the scale of the problem and the nature of the problem. And tomorrow we'll talk about some groups that have actually started to do some things in this regard, and how their efforts could create bigger impact. So thank you again, Professor Kundu. Lisa, you're still there. Thank you very much. And again, thank you very much for Charcha 2020 from us at WRI India and Omidyar Network India as well, for allowing us to host this session. So thank you very much.